Let me be direct with you from the outset, because what I am about to describe is invisible to most people, and yet it is the infrastructure on which the modern world runs. Three undersea internet cables cut by Houthi forces operating in the Red Sea. And as a result of those three cuts, 44% of the communication bandwidth connecting Europe and Asia has gone offline. I want you to understand what 44% means in practice, not in the abstract, not as a geopolitical statistic. Every time you send an email to someone in Europe or Asia, every time a bank in London processes a transaction with a counterparty in Singapore, every time a logistics company in Germany tracks a shipment moving through the Indian Ocean, every time a hospital system in the Netherlands queries a pharmaceutical supply database in India, every time any digital communication crosses the boundary between the European and Asian portions of the global internet, 44% of the infrastructure that carries that communication is now unavailable. The traffic that would have traveled through those three cables is now being rerouted through the remaining capacity, creating congestion, latency, packet loss, and systemic degradation across the digital infrastructure of two continents. In the next 18 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly what undersea cables are and why they are so catastrophically difficult to protect, what it means for the global digital economy when nearly half of transatlantic and Eurasian bandwidth disappears simultaneously, why the targeting of undersea cables represents a strategic escalation with no precedent in the history of the Houthi conflict, and what the international community's response to this act tells us about the structural vulnerabilities of the global digital infrastructure and the absence of any adequate framework for protecting it. Subscribe now if you are watching this and realizing that you are not getting this kind of analysis anywhere else, because what we are about to discuss is the most important story nobody is explaining properly. Let us begin with what undersea cables actually are and where they sit in the infrastructure of global communication, because the invisibility of this infrastructure is the reason it has been so catastrophically underprotected. The global undersea cable network consists of approximately 500 cable systems carrying over 400 distinct cables that collectively carry approximately 95% of all international internet and telecommunications traffic. These cables are not thick armored conduits running along the ocean floor. They are, in most of their length through deep water, roughly the diameter of a garden hose encased in a protective sheath and resting on the ocean floor at depths that make regular inspection impractical and repair operations enormously time-consuming and expensive. In shallower coastal waters, where they are more accessible, they receive additional armoring, but the majority of their length is essentially unprotected in any meaningful military sense. The vulnerability of this infrastructure has been documented, discussed, and warned about in security and policy circles for years. NATO has published assessments of the risk to undersea cable infrastructure from hostile action. Independent researchers have modeled the consequences of targeted cable cuts on global communication systems, and every assessment has reached the same conclusion. The undersea cable network is among the most strategically significant and least protected critical infrastructure on Earth. The reason it has not been better protected is a combination of the enormous cost of monitoring the relevant ocean areas, the technical difficulty of providing meaningful security over the thousands of kilometers of cable routes that cross international waters, and frankly, the failure of political imagination that allowed governments to treat an infrastructure this important as somebody else's responsibility. Last night, Houthi forces demonstrated that this failure has consequences. Stay with me, because this is where the analysis becomes impossible to dismiss. Announcement number one: cutting three undersea cables simultaneously is not an accident and not an operation of opportunity. It is the result of deliberate operational planning against a specific strategic target set. And this one matters more than any other element of what happened last night. Undersea cables are not randomly distributed across the ocean floor. They follow specific routes determined by geography, by existing cable infrastructure, and by the locations of the landing stations where they come ashore and connect to terrestrial networks. The cables most critical to European Asian communications follow routes that pass through the Red Sea, through the Bab el Mandeb Strait at the Red Sea's southern end, through the Gulf of Aden and across the Indian Ocean. This routing reflects the geographic reality that the Red Sea is the most direct maritime connection between the Mediterranean, where European cables land, and the Indian Ocean, through which Asian cables travel. Houthi forces control significant portions of the Yemeni coast along the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. They have demonstrated through their campaign against commercial shipping in the Red Sea the ability to identify and engage targets in the maritime environment. The extension of this capability to undersea cable infrastructure was not a theoretical development. It was a logical extension of existing operational capability to a new target set. According to analysis by researchers who study undersea cable security and by technology policy analysts who have tracked the development of Houthi maritime operations, the specific cables cut represent a selection that maximizes disruption to European-Asian communications specifically rather than targeting cables serving other route combinations. The 44% bandwidth reduction is not a coincidental outcome. It is the result of targeting a specific set of cables whose combined capacity represents the identified share of the bandwidth that analysts with access to cable route mapping could have calculated in advance. This is not improvised operational behavior. It is strategic targeting of communications infrastructure with a level of analytical sophistication that should fundamentally revise how the international community assesses Houthi operational planning capability. Received. That is announcement number 1. Announcement number 2, the economic consequences of 44% European-Asian bandwidth loss are not primarily experienced as internet slowdowns. They are experienced in the financial, logistics, and supply chain systems that underpin the global economy. This is the dimension of the cable cuts that goes most unreported in mainstream coverage. Modern financial systems depend on undersea cable infrastructure in ways that are both direct and invisible to most users. International electronic payments, foreign exchange transactions, securities trading, and the coordination of global banking operations all depend on the low latency, high bandwidth communication that undersea cables provide. When 44% of European Asian bandwidth disappears, the systems that depend on this infrastructure do not simply slow down. They experience latency increases that trigger risk management protocols in automated trading systems, that create reconciliation delays in international payment processing, and that can produce cascading failures in the interconnected systems that manage global financial flows. According to analysis by financial technology researchers and by economists who study the relationship between communication infrastructure and financial system performance, the disruption of undersea cable bandwidth at the scale demonstrated last night produces measurable effects on financial market efficiency, on transaction completion rates, and on the latency-sensitive automated systems that now account for a substantial portion of global financial transaction volume. The logistics implications are equally significant. Global supply chains are managed through digital systems that depend on real-time communication between parties located on different continents. When bandwidth is severely constrained, the communication that coordinates container ship routing, customs clearance, warehouse management, and inventory replenishment systems degrades. The physical goods keep moving, but the digital coordination of their movement becomes less precise, less reliable, and more prone to the delays and errors that multiply into supply chain disruptions downstream. Stay with me because what I am about to describe is the most concerning dimension of this story. Announcement number 3, the international community has no adequate framework for responding to the deliberate cutting of undersea cable infrastructure. And the absence of that framework is itself a strategic vulnerability that the actors who planned this operation fully understood. And this is the element that almost no mainstream analysis is addressing. Undersea cables cross international waters, territorial waters, and the exclusive economic zones of multiple countries. The legal framework governing responsibility for their protection, liability for their damage, and the obligations of states to prevent their deliberate destruction by actors operating within or from their territory is fragmented, contested, and, as a practical matter, inadequate to the threat that last night's operation has demonstrated. The specific legal questions raised by Houthi cable cutting include whether the cables constitute protected civilian infrastructure under international humanitarian law, what obligations Yemen has under its status as a signatory to relevant international treaties, what responses are available to the states whose communications infrastructure has been damaged, and what role international bodies have in responding to deliberate infrastructure sabotage on this scale. None of these questions has a clear, settled answer in existing international law. And in the absence of clear answers, the default behavior of states facing this situation is to seek bilateral diplomatic solutions, to file protests, and to initiate repair operations, all of which take time and none of which addresses the fundamental vulnerability that has been demonstrated. According to legal scholars with expertise in the law of undersea infrastructure and in international humanitarian law as applied to modern hybrid warfare, the deliberate targeting of undersea communications cables sits in a legal gray zone that existing frameworks are not adequate to address. This gray zone is precisely the environment that actors seeking to impose costs without triggering clear legal or military consequences prefer to operate in. And the operation last night was planned with this legal reality fully in mind. Received. That is announcement number 3. Now let us talk about what is really happening behind the headlines, because there are two stories playing out simultaneously, and the mainstream media is only covering one of them. The story being covered is the immediate digital disruption, the 44% bandwidth loss, the rerouting of traffic, the repair timelines, the technical dimensions of what undersea cable cuts mean for internet performance. These are legitimate subjects of journalistic attention. The story not being covered is the strategic story. The story about what it means when a non-state military organization demonstrates the capability and the will to cut the undersea cable infrastructure connecting two continents. The story about the absence of any adequate international framework for protecting this infrastructure or responding to its deliberate destruction. The story about the systemic vulnerabilities that 44% bandwidth loss reveals in the financial, logistics, and communication systems of the global economy. And the story about what this operation tells us about the evolution of Houthi strategic planning and operational capability. Think carefully about what this represents. The undersea cable network has been treated by governments and by the global economy as a piece of infrastructure so fundamental that its deliberate destruction was outside the realistic threat envelope. The insurance models, the security frameworks, the contingency planning, and the political attention allocated to its protection have all reflected this assumption. Last night, that assumption was proven wrong. The cost of having held it will compound over the weeks and months it takes to repair 3 major cable systems. This pattern has a historical parallel that is exact. Consider the role of telegraph cable cutting in the First World War. On the first day of the war, the British Navy cut Germany's undersea telegraph cables, severing Germany's direct communications with the Americas and with its colonies. The act was treated as a routine extension of naval operations, but its strategic consequences were disproportionate to its operational simplicity. Germany was forced to route its communications through wireless transmission that the British could monitor, through neutral countries whose cooperation was uncertain, and through communication channels that were slower, less secure, and less reliable than the direct cable connections that had been severed. The cutting of 3 cables in the Red Sea follows the same strategic logic in a modern context. The technological medium is different. The strategic objective, degrading an adversary's communication infrastructure to impose coordination costs and create intelligence opportunities, is the same. So where does this leave us? Let me give you 3 clear paths. Path 1, emergency repair operations, restore the severed cables within 60 to 90 days, which is the typical repair timeline for deep water cable cuts. During the repair period, traffic is rerouted through alternative capacity with manageable degradation. The economic and operational consequences are significant but bounded. International pressure, including potential enforcement action by naval forces protecting repair operations, deters further cable cutting. This is the best case scenario. Path 2, repair operations are delayed or disrupted because the operational environment in the Red Sea remains too hostile for cable repair vessels to work safely. The bandwidth deficit extends for months rather than weeks. The economic consequences compound. Alternative capacity is overwhelmed. And the pattern of targeting communications infrastructure, having demonstrated its effectiveness, is repeated against additional cable systems. This path, given the current operational environment in the Red Sea, is more likely than path 1. Path 3, the cutting of undersea cables becomes a sustained component of Houthi military strategy, with systematic targeting of additional cable systems as repair operations restore the 3 already severed. In this scenario, the 44% bandwidth loss is not temporary. It is a floor that rises as additional cables are cut, and the global economy must adapt to a sustained reduction in the communication infrastructure capacity that it has built its digital systems around. This is the most severe path, and it is the one that the current absence of any adequate deterrent framework makes impossible to exclude. I believe the honest assessment places us tracking toward path 2, with path 3 as the risk that the absence of an adequate international response to last night's operation makes increasingly plausible. Tell me in the comments whether you believe governments have been adequately warned about the vulnerability of undersea cable infrastructure and whether you think the response to last night's operation will be adequate to prevent a repetition. Tell me what you think the most economically significant consequence of 44% bandwidth loss will prove to be over a 60-day disruption period. We will keep tracking every development in the Houthi maritime operations campaign, in the repair operations, and in the international response to the strategic use of undersea cable targeting. That is what this analysis does every single day. Subscribe now, share this with everyone in your network who uses the internet, which is everyone in your network and who needs to understand why what happened last night affects them directly. Turn on notifications so you do not miss the next update, and we will see you in the next analysis.